Hey, welcome back to the How to Podcast series. It's Dave with you. How are you? I hope you're doing well. Got a message came in through my SpeakPipe, which is great. It's on my website over at howtopodcast.ca, and the question was around where to start as a podcaster. And Colin was asking, should we start with a live podcast, a video podcast, or an audio-only podcast? And asking my thoughts on where to start. So here we go. We're going to jump into it and figure out where's a good starting point for your new podcast. Here we go. So again, over at howtopodcast.ca, you can leave a voice message, which is through SpeakPipe. There's a little microphone right on my website, and you can actually leave a message for me, and it comes right to me, and you can hear your voice right here on the podcast. So if you have a podcasting question, don't be shy. You're going to be a podcaster. You're going to be on the microphone. People are going to hear your voice as a podcaster. So start now by asking a good question, and I'll answer it here for you, just like Colin did. Colin, let's cue you up. Here you go. Here's Colin's question for us today here on the How to Podcast series. Colin.
Hi Dave, this is Colin from Watertown, New York. I am thinking of starting a podcast. I am wondering what is the best path to start on. Should I do an audio-only podcast, a video podcast, or a live show? Have you ever considered doing a live podcast? I am curious if that would be a good starting point as I start building my new podcast. I figured that you might have some insight that I haven't considered yet. Thanks for your podcast. Really enjoy the topics that you cover. Looking forward to hearing my question on an upcoming episode. Thanks again, Dave.
Okay, Colin, that's a great question. Thank you for leaving that for me. So as far as starting your podcast, it's going to rely a lot on what your capabilities are, the gear you have, your ability to do multiple things, and your audience. Those are a lot of questions you need to answer. With an audio-only podcast, you don't have to worry about cameras, lights. You don't have to worry about any of that stuff. Your editing time is significantly less with an audio podcast compared to a video podcast, if we compare the two. An audio-only podcast is going to be about a 4-to-1 ratio for the amount of time that you record to how long it takes you to produce the podcast. So a 1-hour show could be 4 hours of work from beginning to end. A video podcast is significantly more when you have to do all of the visuals that go along with doing a video podcast. That does take significantly longer, way more than a 4-to-1 ratio for audio. It's much, much more for video. So if you have the cameras, if you have all the lights, if you have all that, and video is your thing, a video podcast might be a great idea. The other one you talked about was a live show. I'm going to talk about that a little bit more in depth here, because I have some thoughts about a live podcast and some things for you to consider as you do the planning, if that's what you're thinking about doing for your show. The one thing about going back to video for a second is video podcasts are traditionally available through an RSS feed, and that's that feed that sends your audio or video out to the world. That is possible through Apple, Spotify, YouTube, and some other places. But you got to think about where your audience is. And we go back to our why and who our audience is. Where do they consume a podcast? Now, if they're not visually looking at a podcast, or they're not watching it on their phone, they're doing something else at the time, a video podcast might not be as beneficial to an audience member than an audio show. Audio podcasts are traditionally easier to consume, widely distributed, and don't take up as much room. Another side thing about video versus audio storage for your audio files is not as big of a deal because your audio files are pretty small in file size. Video files, once they're done and produced, are quite large. So think about your computer and your hard drive service and where you're going to store all this. Some hosting sites charge you by the amount of file size you upload. An audio file is much smaller than a video file. So whether you want to move up into a higher paying monthly fee to host your video files for distribution, that's a cost. Again, think about it up front. Can you afford the cost of running a video show? I'm going to just kind of pause here for a second and say, I had my choice of starting my next show. Yes, I would love to jump into video. Yes, I'd love to consider live. but audio is the cheapest way to start. I have all the video assets when I do my recordings with my guests. I have my video recordings when I do my podcasts on my own. So I do have a library that I could repurpose and use in the future, but I like audio only to start because if you're new to podcasting and new to technology, it's a lot easier to learn audio first and then graduate from there if that's your goal. So that's kind of my little side tangent there. When we start talking about live video and live podcasting, one thing to consider when you're thinking about live podcasting is at a time and a date when you're live. You're obviously not going to be live 24/7, so it'll be Friday at 7 p.m. or Saturday morning at 10 a.m. And not all of your viewers, listeners, and followers are available at the times that you pick to be live. And there's this one thing that we kind of gotten away from, which was live. It's called radio. And what I'm finding is there's a lot of podcasters who seem bored in podcasting, and being live is the next thing for them as they create a live show, which is once a week, and it's out there in the world, and they have the chat, and they have all these spinning plates that they do live in front of you as a podcast. But for the most of us, we aren't available every time our favorite podcaster goes live. So we usually end up catching the recording later on, which is a podcast. When I think of the whole thing about being live as the place to be, there's a lot of great advantages to being live. Yeah, I understand. Some people like to watch the podcast being made. You get feedback right away from your audience while you're recording. That's kind of cool. You can take questions from your audience. That's kind of neat. It does build community. Being live can actually help you become a better podcaster, really, because you have to organize, you have to know where you're going, and you get to talk to different platforms all at the same time. That's kind of cool. The one thing that I find, though, many of the podcasters who podcast about podcasting and do live shows is they are completely distracted by the technology, completely distracted by the visual things that are going on, the chat, all the multiple things they're doing, and they forget about the audio-only listener who comes later to hear the podcast, where they put something on the screen and they talk about the fact that they made an error on the slide on the screen. And as an audio listener, I don't care about the video version of what you're doing. I don't care about the video that you're showing on your screen or the picture or the microphone you're holding up. I can't see it. And if we're talking about podcasting, it should be available to everyone and be inclusive to all listeners. Personal opinion, I find that video and live podcasting that is repurposed as an audio podcast in the future does not include the audio listener the same way it does those who were there live to watch it happen. So if you're going to go with a live video, if you're going to go with a video version of your podcast, think about all of the technology you need. You need tools, you need online sources like a StreamYard or a Riverside or something that can send your podcast out into the world in live as it happens. There's a lot of things going on there. If that's your natural bent, that you're good at that, if you're a gamer and you're used to being on live in front of an audience, then this won't be as hard for you. Then try it. But whatever you do, audio, video, or live, remember who your biggest audience is. Are you talking to the 5 people watching you on YouTube? Or are you talking to the 1,000 people who listen to your show as an audio podcast later? Who's more important? Who should you be talking or spending your focus on? The 5 that are with you live or the 1,000 that listen later? I find that many people who have live shows default to the small audience in front of them, ignoring those that come later. The other thing is you can also edit a live video podcast in front of a live audience and make it more audio friendly as an alternative. So some of that distracted squirrel stuff that happens during your podcast, you don't have to include that in the audio version of your show. You can easily delete that. Just remove it. So when you get off on a tangent about something seen on the screen, or a video of this, or a picture of that, or a microphone in my hand, anything that doesn't bring value to your audio-only audience, you can just delete it. Because then your audio audience isn't scratching their head going, oh, you're not talking to me anymore. You're talking to those that were with you live. And if we're all about being inclusive as podcasters, we need to find anything that excludes people from our show and delete it so that we reach the most people possible. Okay. So again, a downside to having a live podcast would be the fact that people aren't always available to join you for your show. But also think about some of the technical issues. Streaming live it's a whole nother skill set. Something you really would need to practice if you're going to do that. You can't edit any of your mistakes as well if you're live. You can't cut out anything. So if you make a big mistake, if your guest says something that they want deleted, well, guess what? It was live, and everyone that was there live heard you say the thing you want me to delete. I can't take that back. So I can definitely edit it in the audio version if I do that. And again, if you're a live podcaster and you don't edit your show for audio, that's not good. But just overall, I would just say, start with where your comfort level is. Again, if you're a video first person, you've been a YouTuber for years, and you've been on YouTube and you got that down pat, then a video podcast might be a great start for you. Awesome. But then think about taking that video only podcast, and how can somebody who doesn't have access to video listen to your show? If you want to grow your audience, then make it an audio only podcast. Again, take out all the things that don't relate to an audio only listener and bring the best of your video podcast, your live podcast, into the audio only world, and include your audience and grow your community. Vice versa. If you have an audio only podcast, what about your video podcasting community who doesn't know about you? You can start with something as easy as uploading a static image MP3 to YouTube with just a picture with the audio attached. It's a great starting point. Don't let anybody talk you down or talk down to you because you do that. It's a great starting point. You can always do more later, but at least do that. That gets you onto the platform, and they might come to you and find your podcast because they found you on YouTube or wherever else. So don't be afraid of that. As a bare minimum, get started. I do it because I'm not concerned about the YouTube algorithm. I'm not interested in making money from my YouTube channel. So all those complaints about it not being a real video doesn't mean anything to me, frankly, because that's not my purpose. I just want my video podcast, my audio podcast, to find a home on YouTube, and it's working. So all of you people who say I'm doing it wrong, I'm sorry, but it's working for me, and I find it's a great, easy place to start. Again, somewhere where you can get your foot in the door and get your podcast in front of more people. So again, if I'm starting my show, Colin, from scratch, a new show today, it's going to be audio only first. I'm going to add in video elements of my podcast, maybe snippets that I can share online or as shorts on YouTube or TikTok. I'm going to think about a live podcast maybe in the future, but for me, I'd have to gear up. I'd have to get more gear, more equipment, and learn how to do multiple things at once without the opportunity to edit. So there's a lot of things in there, Colin. I'd love to help you more. If you have more questions, reach out to me anytime. And I'd love to talk about this further. And if you have a question for the How to Podcast series, about your show, anything I can help you with, again, howtopodcast.ca is the website. Go over there, leave me a voice message about your question and your comments, and I'll share them here, just like I did with Colin. Thanks for listening, and go out and start your show, whether that's audio only, a video podcast, or, wow, you're going to do a live show? Let me know. I want to come and join you. I want to be there. But whatever you start now, start soon, and get your voice out there and help people with your message. Thanks for listening to the How to Podcast series. Take care.